If you are anything like me, you may be feeling a little bit bookered out at the moment, but let's dive in one more time to rank the long list and have a guess at what the shortlist is going to look like. Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel and to my last video this booker season, probably. Over the last month and a half I've been chipping away at this year's long list and I was delighted to finish it up a few days ago. We've not got long to go until we find out which 6 books the judges have selected for the shortlist. The announcement is going to be streamed on YouTube and on Instagram on Monday the 16th of September at 7 PM BST. I will link to those live streams in the description if you want to find out which books have made it the very moment it's announced. Until then, Booktube and Bookstagram and every other bookworm out there is feverishly wrapping up and speculating, sharing their personal shortlists and best guesses about what the judges will go for. In this video, I am going to do both of those things, as well as have a look at some of the stats from Goodreads to see how well the books have been received and what a reader's shortlist might look like. Before I get into any of that though, I wanted to just share some thoughts on the long list overall and my experience reading it this year. So at the time of the long list announcement, I had 9 of the books left to read. Well, 10 if you also include They're There. And I'm not the fastest reader, so reading that much in such a short space of time is quite an intense experience, and I think it can push your enjoyment of reading to its limit. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but basically I think that intensity when you are reading can lead to quite a low tolerance for bad books, and it can lead to a low tolerance for boredom, and it can make you have some more extreme reactions to the books that you're reading. For me though, I had a really good time with this list. My average rating this year was 3.92 stars, which is a bit higher than last year's average, which I scored 3.69. Something I think I've really appreciated about the list this year was its thematic consistency without it feeling too samey. Last year, while it had some crackers on the list for sure, it was exceptionally rooted in grief and misery, particularly grief for mothers, and I think that made for a list that didn't feel too exciting, one that sort of brought your mood down and then it kept it there. This year, grief is definitely still a prominent theme, but I think it's elaborated in so many different ways. Like, there's grief for parents, sure, but there are also characters grieving for their culture, for their home, and for what might have been. And that grief is one of many things played out in the list across generations. I really enjoy generational stories, and there are plenty of them in this year's list, unpicking how decisions can ripple and dominoes can fall over the years, how family and cultural trauma is passed down, and how later generations break from it or they don't. One thing that has absolutely stood out to me this year is that the books are filled with a love for reading, for writing, and for books themselves. There are characters in both my friends and this strange eventful history that travel with suitcases completely full of books, and that is an idea that I will need to steal for my next holiday. There is also so much here that emphasises the importance of documentation and of writing things down, and how that writing not being published can leave a gap in our culture and in our history. Just some examples of this, because there are so many threaded through these books. In Wandering Stars, Jude Starr aims to write Native American stories, but they go unfinished. Khaled's father writes Libyan history in My Friends, but he can't publish it for fear of what the Libyan government reaction will be. Gaston writes his family history in This Strange Eventful History and leaves it to his granddaughters. Rafi's writing in Playground is the only way he can express his grief and pain. There is a very important document in the Safekeep, which is the key to unlock the story. And Enlightenment completely revolves around seeking written records that explain what happened to Maria Vaduva, the woman astronomer that has been forgotten by history. This idea of unpublished documentation pops up again and again and again on this list, and I would love to know if that was something knowingly constructed by the judges or if it's just a coincidence. So yeah, I think this is a strong year for the prize. I'm really happy with it and I am very glad to have read it. That said, I know not everyone shares my feelings, and I have seen a fair amount of negativity towards the list online. Part of that, I think, is just the inherent pressure of claiming a list is the best, as the Booker Prize does. After all, there isn't really any such thing as an objective set of best books, and these choices reflect the opinions of the 5 judges, not any objective reality. But I am interested to know if the negativity I'm seeing is reflective of content creators, or at least the ones I see online, or if it is true of readers more generally. And so, of course, I've turned to Goodreads. I did this last year, found it really interesting, so I've decided to do it again. Basically, I've just grabbed all of the Goodreads star ratings for the books and used them to see what the shortlist might look like if it was decided by Goodreads readers. Of course, star ratings aren't the ultimate barometer of quality. Goodreads isn't necessarily the place to look when you are trying to determine what is best, blah, 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 all of that good stuff. But I do think it is a good way to see how readers are feeling about the list. So here it is. First things first, James's score is absurdly high, and that is based on over 70,000 ratings, more than all of the other books on the list combined. The next most read book is Wandering Stars with 18,000 ratings, and Orbital with a little over 5,000 ratings. The least read book is Playground by Richard Powers, but that's not surprising because it's not actually been released yet. It's also notable that there are 4 books here with an average above 4 stars. That's more than last year, which had 3, but it is less than 2022, which had 5. The top 3 books here are all higher than last year's top rated book at the same point in time, which was Tan Twan Eng's House of Doors, which had a score of 4.24 just before the shortlist announcement. But at the same time, a lot of the books in the middle of the pack here are scoring lower than the middle of the pack from last year. As an example, How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney was ranked 10th by readers at the same time last year, but if it were in this list, it would replace Wild Houses on the shortlist because it had a score of 3.79. That got me wondering about the spread of scores, and so I geeked out and plotted them somewhat inexactly on a number line to compare last year's distribution against this year's distribution. And there are some things that I noted here. One is that the average score this year is slightly higher than at the same time last year, but there really isn't much in it. 2, as mentioned already, the highs this year are higher than the highs last year, and the lows are not quite as low. Those 2 little dots that are lower on the 2023 side are Western Lane and Study for Obedience, both of which really interestingly ended up making the shortlist. And 3, both lists have a sort of scrum in the middle where a lot of the books sit. And that middle sits a bit higher on the 2023 list than it does on the 2024 list. Last year, a lot of books were in that sort of 3.8, 3.9 region. And this year, there are a bunch that are scoring 3.6 or 3.7. That concludes my Goodreads geek out, but hopefully you found something interesting to take away there. Right, I have been blathering on enough. Let's get on with this ranking. This is going to be a real whistle-stop tour. I'm just going to say very quickly why I've placed each of the books where I have. I have reviewed every single one of these books though in detail, and so I'll put a link to all of my more in-depth reviews in the description if you want to check them out afterwards. In 13th place is Held by Anne Michaels, and although I have placed this book here and I also didn't give it a brilliant star rating, I don't think this is a bad book. I think this is a very beautifully crafted book, a very beautifully written book. It just didn't work for me personally and my taste in reading. I love some of the things it was doing with science and faith and weaving that into the story, and it was buoyed by the first half, which had quite a strong narrative through line, but the second half, as it becomes more fragmentary and disconnected, it just fell away for me. In 12th place is Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, and this is another one that I think is very beautifully written, well crafted, but to me is just a bit overly long and a little bit of a slog. I think if you are enchanted by this writing, you will be fully immersed by this book and Thomas's story. But some of the drawbacks here just made this feel like I was pushing through it more than luxuriating in it. In 11th place is Orbital by Samantha Harvey, and although this is ranking quite low on my list, there was a lot I really liked about it. I thought the structure was great. I liked what it had to say about perspective and togetherness and distance and what some of those things mean for humanity's bigger problems. And I thought the shared headspace the narration operated in between all the different characters actually worked really well. But it was slow and ponderous and meandering, and I can understand why some people have said that they were a little bit bored by it, because although it's just a slip of a novel, it does feel a lot slower than some of the slower 300 or 400 page books that are on the longlist this year. What a gorgeous cover though. It's just occurred to me that the 3 books that I've ranked lowest on my list this year are all the ones that try and do something with physics or with science, which is kind of strange because I usually love that sort of thing. It's like reading catnip for me, so not sure what's happened there. In 10th place is This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messard. And this is another one that's on the slower side, but these characters have just really stuck with me. I loved the way that we followed them throughout the years. I loved how realistic their stories felt and how things really echoed through the generations. Still on the fence about that epilogue, but ultimately a really solid intergenerational family drama. The next 4 books have very little between them, to be honest, because I think I've got a very clear top 5, but then spots 6 through 9, any of them really could take the final spot on my personal shortlist. So if I did this on a different day, maybe these books would come out in a different order. But for now, my number 9 is Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. I think this was just a lot of fun to read. I really enjoyed the mixture of the spy novel and getting the emails from the other character who was like sharing his musings on the world and sharing lots of scientific facts, or not facts necessarily, but theories about the history of humanity. But I think where this book doesn't quite pip some of the other ones to the post is that, much like Sadie Smith, the protagonist's mission in the book, the novel doesn't really amount to much. It doesn't add up to more than the sum of its parts in quite the same way that some of the others do. Still, a very good, fun read, and I had a great time with it. In 8th place is Playground by Richard Powers. And I think I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to people who have read this, because this has been getting absolute raves, and I came to it with such high expectations. And I think it's hard to argue that this is not a very well-written and well-constructed book. It definitely is. But of the Richard Powers books that I've read, and particularly Bewilderment and The Overstory, his most recent ones, I think this just isn't quite up to the same standards. That said, intricately plotted, comes together absolutely beautifully in the end. I think the ending is probably maybe the best ending of all the books here. It's really, really great. In 7th place, and just missing out on my personal shortlist, is Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. And this is probably a fairly controversial placement for this one, because this seems to me to be a little bit of a punching bag in this year's Longlist for readers. And I do think it's fair that you will either love its shtick or you will really, really hate it, because it fully commits. It is a book that is breathless and physical and structured in this quite forced way around the different matches of a boxing tournament. But I absolutely loved it. I do recognise though that I read it before it was longlisted, and so it didn't quite have the pressure of being a Booker nominated book at the time, but it has really stuck with me and I've got a lot of fondness towards it. Right then, let's get into my shortlist. And in 6th position is Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. This is the book that I read longest ago. I actually read it back in December and I just loved it. I think it's got a very quiet power. I think it's got a dark humour through it, and I loved the characterisation. All of the dialogue felt so real, the characters felt complex, and it was just small town drama played out in this really, really interesting way. I will say though, people have been describing this as a crime novel, and I just think it is not, or at least that description doesn't betray what it really is. It's a very quiet character study, or set of character studies, and I just think it's gorgeous, and I'd love to read more from Colin Barrett. In 5th place is a book that surprised me by being on the list, but also has surprised me by being in my shortlist, and that is Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. I just really enjoyed reading it. I loved the voice of the narrator. I loved how it's set in this isolated place, and there's some strangeness going on without becoming too fantastical, but it is like a beautiful metaphor for everything else going on in this character's life. I read it quite early on in the list and it's really stuck with me. The book I've got in 4th place is another probably fairly controversial placement, and that is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. And the reason this is slightly controversial is because I think there are question marks as to whether it really stands alone. And I think it's fair to say that novels that appear on prize lists should be able to be read in isolation and be really great and meaningful to readers. I read this sandwiched around there. So I read it in conjunction with the book that it is both a prequel and a sequel to, and that reading experience for me was absolutely magical. And so I struggle to recognise whether it really should be placed here on the list, but I'm just going by what my experience of it was, and I completely understand if other readers struggled with it, particularly the second half, which may not make oodles of sense if you haven't read there. But yeah, for me, the writing was utterly wonderful. It's exactly the type of writing that I love, and Tommy Orange got me in a chokehold. In 3rd place is The Safekeep by Yael van der Woden. This is just brilliant. This is just so much fun to read. In my opinion, it's got loads of depth to it. There are twists and turns that I personally didn't see coming, even if other people did see them coming. And I just really enjoyed reading about these characters. Isabel is this iconic spiky protagonist, and I was just thrilled to be along for the ride. To me, this read like a lost classic. We are into the top 2, and my number 2 from this year's Booker Longlist is My Friends by Hisham Matar. This is just a beautiful, thoughtful, reflective book about friendship and isolation and the bonds we make with others when we are away from our home and from our culture. People have said it's slow, but I was really gripped by this character and this voice. It's so full of melancholy and there's so much beauty in that. And the audio is read by Hisham Matar himself, so I was like listening along while reading certain chapters. Really, really well done, and I utterly loved it. And then my number one, to be honest, untouchable at the top of this list, is James by Percival Everett. It's on every prize list going this year, and it is no wonder why, because I think this is the best thing I've read from Percival Everett. He is a satirist through and through, and this is just the perfect balance of comedy and darkness, tackling the horrors of slavery with an inventiveness that brings so much life to it. It brings so much emotion, and it's still at its heart an adventure story that's having a conversation with a book that's 200 years old. I just think it's a phenomenal achievement. Everyone should read this. If you haven't read it, if you're not one of those 70,000 people who have already rated it on Goodreads, you should join them because it is well worth the ride. It's brilliant, and it's my winner. That makes these 6 books my personal shortlist, but these almost certainly will not be the ones on the actual shortlist. My guess at what the judges will pick, I think James and My Friends are pretty undeniable, and I would expect to see them make it. And I do think that Stoneyard Devotional is also quite likely to make the cut. But beyond that, I think the judges might go for Playground, The Strange Eventful History, which Ian Lee is probably going to be really advocating for, and Held by Anne Michaels, because I think if you buy into its style, and by virtue of being on this list, the judges must have bought into it, then you will find this absolutely transportive and intoxicating. And so I think if you love this, you'll really, really love it. And therefore, I think this is my guess at what the actual shortlist will be when it is announced on Monday. I would love to hear from you down in the comments what you make of this year's longlist and which books you expect to make the cut. Do let me know what your highlights have been. And in fact, if you have watched the video this far, my challenge for you is to leave a comment with an emoji that represents your favourite read from the list this year. And please do guess which books other people's emojis represent. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like button. And if you're not subscribed and you'd like to see more from me, maybe you'll consider hitting the subscribe button too. But until next time, toodles.